evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. This evening we're going to be speaking about the scandal of food poverty, which afflicts far too many people in the fifth biggest economy in the world. And there's been an abject failure, in my opinion, of policymakers who have allowed this situation to develop. And of course, it's got considerably worse as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. To discuss this whole issue about food poverty this evening, we've got three excellent guests, and I'm delighted to welcome back Ray Woolford, who was with us last week. Ray runs the biggest independent food bank in the UK. We also have Charlotte Hughes with us this evening. Charlotte is a blogger and writes for the Morning Star, and she's also spent many years campaigning against universal credit and the benefit reforms. And final guest is Gregory. She's a former Labour, now independent councillor and a retired nurse, and is a vegan campaigner and a good comrade of mine. But let me start with Ray, if I can, Ray, because you are at very much the sharp end in terms of seeing the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in relation to how it's affected the usage of food banks and your own food bank in particular. And I wondered if perhaps if you could just start us off really by your take on what we're seeing in relation to food poverty and whether in your experience it's actually getting worse or staying the same. I mean, the statistics seem to indicate that it's got considerably worse as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you guys for actually having this debate. It's a really, really important one. We've had, talk about the climate crisis, the housing crisis, and nobody's actually talking about the food crisis, which is coming down the tracks. At the moment, as I speak to you, FareShare, which is one of the biggest suppliers of food to food banks and outreach projects, is now merging with the Felix project, which is a similar type of operation, which will actually cut down quite dramatically the number of food suppliers that feed food banks such as us, supplies with food for our network. The other two problems we have coming down the line, of course, is Brexit. We had today the government announced that up to 7,000 lorries could be waiting, 2 days to get food into Britain. And we've also had the government say that we need into shielding. People may not be aware that when the government announced shielding, people were sent a letter told to shield, and then they were told they would get food parcels from the government and they would get a volunteer support. The reality was that after 13 weeks, the government alone confirmed that only 30,000 people got food parcels. They had 750,000 people, but as usual with the government, it was a complete mess up. And I still know people today who were shielding but never got any food. And we were taking calls from across the UK from people who were literally starving. And only 2 weeks ago, we heard of the story of a poor young woman who was found starved to death with her baby. And that is the reality that's happening at the moment. Food poverty is getting worse and worse. Those of us that work this sector are being frozen out by big organizations. They now call the food sector the third sector. It's becoming harder and harder to get access to food at your local supermarket. Years ago, your local community groups, Sally Army, the local cat protection league would have collection points. When you go to your supermarket today, it's all corporate. And what people don't seem to realize with the food crisis, if you want to operate as a food bank these days, not only is it increasingly costly with the insurance and the procedures you have to follow just to feed your fellow human beings, but also some of them now even charge you a franchise fee. I kid you not. And they call it a franchise fee. For £1,500 a year, you can open your own food bank. And so the issue for me is that what's happening is the people at the most in need, the most vulnerable, those that are too poor to have internet, those that are too poor to have access to a smartphone. And of course, in COVID lockdown, there's no community centres, there's no advice centres, there's no libraries. How are these people going to eat? And with the food crisis we're having at the moment, people will be starving to death. And I've just done a freedom of information request last week, trying to actually get the figures for how many people have been discovered so far during this crisis who have starved to death. And that's quite scandalous in itself. And I just want to throw in another point. Every year for the past 5 years, I've been doing freedom of information requests into the number of people jailed and criminalized stealing to eat. Quite often, this is people going to the yards of, say, your local supermarket and taking out of the bins that are food that has been thrown out and not wanted. On average, 13 to 14,000 people who have been hungry, who've been stealing that food, have been prosecuted. They've been fined on average £150 per person. If they had £150, they wouldn't be stealing food. And on average, they've had a 2-week jail sentence. How is that going to help people in poverty and people in hunger get into the work and employment status if they don't just have a problem with eating and feeding and housing themselves, if they've then got a criminal record that goes with it? And really, we need to be talking about the food crisis and how it affects all of us in a way that we're not. You know, many of us would be with our elderly relatives on a Sunday back in the day, and they would put tea on the table, and on Monday they would be at the food bank. Food hunger is something that our own families are too embarrassed to tell each other that they have. And we need to have a open discussion about how we access food, the rights of access to food, and to stop people in the 5th, 6th richest economy in the world from starving to death, which is becoming far too common in Tory Britain.
Yes, and of course we've heard that the government are planning to end the furlough scheme at the end of October, and various bodies have suggested that the consequence of that will mean that we'll see a massive, an even bigger increase in the use of food banks. And I think the Joseph Rowntree Foundation are predicting nearly 750,000 additional people being plunged into poverty as a direct consequence of that decision. And then, of course, a bit further down the track, the plans to reduce universal credit by £20 a week. I think that's due to come in April. I mean, how are you sort of planning for that, Ray, in the next sort of few months, given that there's likely to be a big upsurge?
Well, the problem I have with my food bank is that I feed everybody. So we don't get any state aid. We don't get any council government funding. Because we help refugees, single mums, LGBT, the homeless, people in temporary housing, the disabled, all the funding's focused. So if you, for example, feed the disabled, then you'll get funding for disabled. But if you feed disabled people and refugees, you can't get funding. We feed nearly 5,000 people a month across 6 boroughs. Because we're based in Lewisham, we can't get funding from Lewisham because we feed 5 other boroughs. We feed 140 families in Greenwich, but we can't get funding from Greenwich because we're based in Lewisham. And so what we're actually doing on the 1st of October, which is Black History Month, it's also part of the Global Poverty Awareness Month globally, we're opening in London, in Deptford, the first ever COVID-aware food advice and solidarity hub, which will open up as a food bank, food pantry, charity shop, advice and support for people that don't have internet. And the concept behind it is that we recycle food, etc. The community does it. And within just having 100 clients, the project is self-financing. So we don't have to rely on government funding, but the community, just by paying a small membership fee, can actually recycle, buy food, buy toiletries, and through the charity shop pay the rent, which then has a model that we believe can work in Margate, in Glasgow, in Peru, in Madrid, into Ashton-under-Lyne. So what we're trialing on the 1st of October is the first community-based, old-fashioned food hub and community base where it would be totally self-financing. We hope would be the model that other communities around the country can copy, because we can demonstrate that it costs almost nothing to set up, but anybody can duplicate it. So that's what we're doing at the moment, because the state and local councils are failing, and those most at need cannot access the internet. And without access to the internet, many of the most vulnerable cannot get any grants. They can't even get universal credit because you need to have internet in order to apply. They can't go to the library or the advice centre because they're all closed. And of course, we have evictions and all the other problems that people need support and help with. And there's also a lot of people that can't read and write. There's lots of people who are not particularly internet savvy. And of course, with massive furlough scheme coming to an end, what people don't realize, a lot of food banks get food from cafes, from restaurants. At the end of the week, when they get food that they've overcooked or they've oversupplied, they give that food to the food banks. So the food banks are now, because of the closure of cafes and pret-a-manger and all these closures, has a very negative impact on us because it restricts what food we supply. And I with the largest, because we open 7 days a week to feed people in crisis. So that gives us the option to give people healthy food. And most of our clients might have dietary requirements. We're the only food bank in the country that takes into account people's dietary requirements, whether they're vegan, gluten, halal, or kosher, or gluten-free, lactose tolerant. Just because people are poor, you don't just give them a food pass and say, on your way. Not everybody has means to cook, and everybody will have some type of health reason that they can't eat certain types of food. So it's very, very complex field to be in, which is why I wrote Food Bank Britain, my book, as guidance on the subject to help other groups around the world sort of establish these projects. But the reality is that we're having to help ourselves. We have to, take back our community centres, which are boarded up mainly around the UK, are being sold off for development. And we need to reclaim the community spaces that every council has and turn them into community kitchens, support networks, sow amend. Even with COVID, there's lots of things we can be doing in smaller groups to help each other, whether we have rotas for community kitchens, whether we have rotas for, book sharing. There's lots of things we could be doing, but I think nobody's really talking enough about the shortage and the worry that far too many people have about putting food on the table every week.
I mean, it's truly shocking what you said about the number of people being prosecuted because they're desperate and having to, steal food to survive. I just wonder what our policymakers have said, if anything, about that. And just on your point about, obviously the people in your local area are incredibly lucky having you and the project that you run. But it was really interesting what you were saying there about the model that could be rolled out in other parts of the country. And is there an online way in which people could access that information, or could they contact you directly, or could you give the resistance movement something that we can actually promote around the country to help other groups actually establish their own similar project to yours that you're running in Lewisham?
Yeah, it's a really good idea. The comprehensive work that we do as well. The range of things. People don't have to do all the services we can do. They can do one side or another. The problem we have in London, of course, is that shop rents are so high. Even though everything is closing down, the new base we have in Deptford was a coffee shop that actually couldn't survive COVID, and so we've fortunate been able to use that as an opportunity. But outside London, shops and community centres are a lot cheaper to operate, and therefore the model, you could run it even in your tower block with just 50 people. So I will be sending out a profile to everybody, and including yourselves, this week with guidance, and then with my email that people can get in touch with to get this movement. My activism isn't about me doing something small in Deptford. My activism is about empowering people. And I'll give you another good example when we talk about activism. One of the things I campaigned for a very long time was against fuel poverty. And we had this idea of saying, why don't government and council buildings put solar panels on their roofs when the government had the buyback scheme, and then sell the energy to the government. The government then gives the council income, and that helps tackle fuel poverty and give people low-cost fuel. And the council said, oh, you can't do that. So at my food bank, we organised a public meeting, and we got together unskilled local residents, and we set up a cooperative. And we decided that if the council wouldn't put green energy and tackle fuel poverty, we would. So we went through all the process. We got all the advice on setting up a community energy company, and went through all the structures. There's lots of help online. And then we did our first share offer, and we raised £380,000 to put solar panels on local community centres, local churches, and local schools, which of course give them cheap energy. And the profit we made, we use today to tackle fuel poverty, and the investors who invested get 4% return, which is far better than you get from a bank or a building society. So it's a very sound economic model. A year later, we did the same, more schools, more community centres, and we raised over £500,000 in the second wave. And so my activism is really about saying, you know, the government is meant to be doing this thing. If you won't do it, I would do it. I would show you the way. If we can do it, the government and the state, with the buildings and with the planning and with the finances, could actually roll these models out. And it seems extraordinary to me that councils who are really elected to serve the people are increasingly disenfranchising the very people who need them and their services the most. And these are very simple ideas like solar energy, or giving over community centres to grassroots food projects who can transform the lives of thousands of people at no cost to the council. But of course, everybody's playing party politics, and that's what gets in the way of the reality of what's going on. And just quickly want to say about the crime figures. The first year I did the crime figures, freedom of information, the government gave me the figures for the entire country. It was 13,487 people jailed in the first year that I requested that information. The following year, the government was so alarmed about the press and the way I was taking this that they refused and said that it was too expensive to collect that data, and I would have to ask each region for that data separately. So just for the London region, I got in touch with the Metropolitan Police in London, and just for London last year, it was over 14,000. So we'd gone from 13,500 nationwide 4 years ago to last year, 14,000 alone in the London region being prosecuted, criminalised, and going to jail. That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. It's truly shocking. And, you know, I keep making this point that Britain is the 5th biggest economy in the world. To have anybody living in poverty, to have anybody being criminalised because they are in poverty, it's an absolute stain on Britain, frankly, and an abject failure of our policymakers. And something I think that all of us, and anybody, you know, viewing this programme this evening, and to take this message beyond that to your friends and neighbours and so on, to encourage people to really take this matter up with your members of Parliament, to say, look, this is just unacceptable. This can't be right, and you know, we need to do something about it. But what I think is particularly inspiring about what you're saying, Ray, is that where there's been a failure of policy makers, where there's been a failure of representative democracy, that, you know, we can do it ourselves. We need to do it ourselves, and demonstrate that, you know, when we stand together, when we work together, you know, there are solutions that we can deliver. And so it'd be really useful, I think, again, as with last week, you know, you came forward with some great ideas in the discussion we had then. If we could share some of that work that you've been doing, some of those ideas that we can then help to share that around the country, then that will be a hugely beneficial effect, I think, of the work that we're trying to do and implementing what you're doing. But let me bring in Candy, if I might, there now, please. Because you are an elected member, you're a councillor on your local authority, and Ray was quite critical, as I am, in fact, actually, of the failings of local authorities and certainly of central government. What's the situation in your local area? I mean, how is your local authority rising to this challenge, or aren't they? Because there are lots of ideas that Ray put forward there, where, you know, an innovative local authority could actually make a real beneficial effect, just simply by, for example, giving local groups free access to some of the buildings that they have in their estate.
Well, we've been throughout COVID, we've been feeding the shielded folk Of course, that's all finished now. They're all escaped, and that doesn't happen. But there was that money initially. There's a lack of community space for food banks. So the people that are setting them up, and they are increasing in numbers, they are scrabbling around for, and they're using church halls, and then the church halls want them back and they have to find somewhere else. And there's it's a great day when somebody does find somewhere permanent, but there is a shocking need. And the use of food banks has a real health impact. And what I was going to talk about tonight is the food poverty and how it affects the poor, and because they are the ones that are suffering, and especially in COVID, we've got food poverty in the low income groups. They don't have access to transport as the majority of better off people do. And like Ray was saying, they don't have cooking facilities, they don't have a fridge, so they have to make their food choices with those things in mind. And we've got 8 to 9 million people in the UK who struggle to get enough to eat, and it's certainly struggling to get the right kind of food to meet nutritional need. The COVID is dragging more people into the equation with their employment issues and their lack of earnings, and they have to this new group of people, they're having to limit themselves to their food choices. And the poorest are always the most disadvantaged and disenfranchised, and their households need to spend 30% of their disposable income to meet their dietary requirements, whereas the wealthiest, it's just 12% of their income, and prices continue to rise, and again the shelves are becoming emptied. And of course, people are struggling like they've never struggled before, and the numbers are rising. They just haven't got enough money to thrive. So there's a tendency for them to shop unhealthily. They go for the cheaper food. They go for the food with higher calories, and the food with higher calories comes with sugars and fats. And so those food choices are very limited. But outwardly, somebody who is malnourished can seem quite healthy. They can be really overweight, but that's because of their access to food is, and especially I want to say about COVID, we're talking about COVID and food poverty, and your immune system is less efficient if you are malnourished. So any infection that you do pick up is going to be more serious. Obesity is a key comorbidity in COVID. So an obese patient who contracts it is 113% more likely to end up in hospital, and 75% more likely to be admitted to ICU, and 48% chance of death. So it's a real issue. Eating low quality food, high fat and sugar and salt leads to malnutrition just as easily as not eating enough food does. And that's why obesity is such a sign of poverty. And especially the children, the poorest children are at more risk of obesity. And this is borne out by a real correlation between poverty and obesity that's happening now. And the parents quite often target these unhealthy foods with the high fat and high sugar because they know the kids won't reject that food. So it won't go to waste. And it also makes you feel fuller, so you're not so hungry. But there's societal problems with that. A malnourished child will be academically and behaviourally more at risk of problems and impaired development. And we know that there's children who are developing type 2 diabetes, and it's difficult to reverse that when you're living in this cycle of deprivation. You are more likely to struggle. You live in poor accommodation, you won't have access, your kids won't have access to a laptop or internet, your kids won't have as many GCSEs, so that affects their future prospects, and you're living hand to mouth. So your life expectancy when you're poor, when you don't have enough food is greatly reduced. And I live in Thanet, which is a poor part of Kent. It's quite a deprived area. Our area, compared to Tunbridge Wells in the leafier suburbs, life expectancy here is 18 years less than somebody in the leafy suburbs. So it just affects your life chances all over. If you're, say, an obese child through food poverty, your lifetime chances, your careers, your health, your wealth prospects, and you're more likely to be bullied and stereotyped, and you're just treated differently in social situations. And this goes into your employment situations too. Whilst physical appearance can determine your career prospects. And we live in a society that values physical appearance. Overweight people often feel unattractive, poor self-image. And then they get into this cycle of eating cheap, unhealthy food, just as they ate when they were kids, and it carries on. So we've had
a point, Candy, from a viewer who's suggesting that because cooking isn't taught in the way in which it used to be in schools, that is an issue. Maybe that's something that we need to be bringing back into schools, and maybe we also should be doing, and maybe this is something that local authorities could be doing, is giving people the skill set to be able to use fresh vegetables and use the the point you made about some people haven't got access to cooking, but where they have, sometimes if they haven't got the skill set to be able to make a nutritious meal, then surely there's a case for the state, for the local authority to be giving people the support they need to be able to do that. What do you say to that?
Yeah, schools could be doing an awful lot, and some schools are. And we're just thinking about growing food. Where does our food come from? And we can teach children to grow food, and then what to do with it, cook it or prepare it. You don't have to cook everything. You can live quite well without cooking stuff. But there is a great need for education into what's healthy. And I remember, is it Marcus Rashford? What's his name? Marcus Rashford, the young footballer. Now he's done a terrific service with lobbying or shaming the government into asking that every child gets a decent meal at lunchtime when they're in school. And how better way of making sure that a child has a future by giving them a decent meal, and it has to be a decent meal. The school meals sometimes, I think it's improved now, but they used to just dish out a pizza and a fatty pie. There's got to be some quality with that to ensure that children have got the nourishment they need, that their body needs, to take them into a better future. There's behavioural problems that really come with malnourishment and hunger, and we're just ignoring that to a great extent. I was going to say about just the global issues of food poverty, because we don't live in a bubble, as we get food from various points, but a lot of what we grow globally is used to feed animals, and raising animals takes an enormous amount of land, and some estimates say that it's 45% of the Earth's total goes to feed animals. And animal feeding is responsible for 91% of the Amazon destruction. That's billions of acres. And we have to learn to feed ourselves differently. We can't keep using growth hormones and antibiotics in intensively farmed animals. We have to we have to think about the antibiotics becoming ineffective, which they are, and we're struggling to treat people with bacterial infections and sepsis. And there's no new antibiotics on the horizon. It's just craziness that's got us into this local and global mess, producing food cheaply and unethically in large numbers. So, and of course, it's the poorest that suffer, and we just need to sort it out We know the government won't do it. There's plenty of research to tell us that farming animals is a bad idea. We know that 50 billion animals are killed each year, and those 50 billion animals would have been raised by an expensive means. Dairy and meat industry has a knock-on effect of limiting food availability for others. If we all gave up meat and dairy, we could feed an additional 350 million people globally. And that's one way to reduce food poverty globally and easily. But at a local level, we have to think about the food banks, because they can only dish out what they're given. And so locally, in my community, we've been growing fruit and veg, and we've been taking the surplus to food banks. And I think probably Ray will know that there's, and I worked in a food bank during lockdown when people were shielding, and although there was plenty of tins and there was plenty of these energy bars, there was very little fruit and veg. And I don't know if Ray will concur with that, but people need fresh fruit and veg. And one way of doing it is for the community to step up and use gardens, window boxes, allotments, to plant crops, and to also, and of course the schools could as well. You know, we go back to education, the schools could do this. And we have to bring children closer to nature and teach them where food comes from, and that we don't have to live unethically. But of course, it's the government's priority should be to feed its people, and it's not doing that. And it costs money to buy food. And COVID has given Chancellor Sunak the opportunity to scrap inflation-linked increases to welfare payments and public sector wage increase. I'm a nurse, and nurse colleagues have been using food banks, so they're now in food poverty. So that's my sort of
certainly a major challenge, no doubt about that, Candy. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, in your introduction, I pointed out that you're a vegan campaigner, and at the end of the 19th century, the Vegetarian Society was established, and they had a close working relationship with the labor movement at the time. And one of the things that they were doing was trying to give access to a nutritious, balanced meals for the working class communities who were obviously struggling and unable to afford meat products and so on. And that was a really interesting development at the time, and we're sort of gone full circle almost in many ways now. Clearly, with some of the points that you're making about the impact of the livestock industry and so on, and the need for good quality food and balanced meals for people is something that a vegetarian or vegan diet could certainly help with. But again, there needs to be done to raise people's consciousness and awareness about that. Interesting. I've had one or two comments about school meals. Your point that you're making about school meals, Candy. People are saying that clearly the school meals are still very poor quality. They've kind of, after the Oliver intervention, that they're not really up to standard. And so, while school meals are important, it's also the standard of school meals is clearly crucial too. But I wonder, I perhaps need to move on now to Charlotte, if I can, and just get Charlotte's take on the situation in relation to where we are with food poverty, and obviously your work that you've been doing, Charlotte, in terms of campaigning about the benefit reforms and universal credit in particular. You'll know from the work that you've been doing the terrible consequences of the benefit reforms that they've been having on people's ability to feed themselves properly, and some of the difficulties that Candy was talking about are directly linked to the parsimonious benefit system in this country. And again, coming back to that point, there is absolutely no justification for that when we are an incredibly wealthy nation. What do you make of the situation that we're in at the moment, Charlotte? And what can we do? What should we be doing to put pressure on the government, but also what can we do practically in the absence of action being taken by the government, and indeed for that matter local authorities, to step up to the challenge?
Yeah, it's a disgrace that everyone is hungry now. It's not just a few people, it's not just a few thousand. People have been hungry for a long time now, since the first inception of universal credit and the benefit reforms with the SANPIP. So we've got more and more and more people that are hungry, and less access to food as well. We've got a problem in my area, and probably lots of other areas as well, that the independent food banks are being priced out, and they get nothing from the council, as what Ray said. And they're basically squeezed out. The council comes to them and says to them, right, we'll give you so much money if we can have an involvement with your food bank. And if they say no, then they go off and they get no help whatsoever, which is absolutely rotten. So certain organisations get certain amounts of money and grants and loans and food donations and everything. And that's disgusting, because I found through the work that I do, the independent food banks actually provide more quality food and more often as well, and without the judgment that you get from some of the bigger organisations. And I think that's absolutely disgusting, you know. I think it's absolutely disgusting that children are still hungry, you know, that we're still hungry, but children especially. Since COVID has happened, a lot of schools have cut the days down. So like my daughter goes into school for 10 to 9 now, and she finishes at 2:30. Now, a lot of children are only being given, including my daughter, 20 minutes for the dinner. That isn't even enough time to queue up for the dinner. So children are going without dinners. And also the schools, I know my daughter's school is demanding that they can't hand cash in, you know, at the office and put money on the card. It's all got to be done now online. Where we've got the problem there is that the parents can't afford to put money online because they haven't got the cash online. They don't do online, and they've got no internet at home. So we've got kids that then going hungry. We've got, again, like you know, you said, it's a disgrace and children should not be hungry. But also, we've got a lot of people now that are newly hungry, that are newly in poverty. So we've got us long-termers going on, and then there's all the new ones, and they don't understand it. You know, a lot of them are hiding away. They don't know how to cope with this, you know. Food banks don't exactly come knocking on your door, you know, unless it's Ray's lot, which they will do. But a lot of them don't, and you don't know they're going on. And when you do approach someone to find out, they're told bluntly, you can only have 3 food parcels, then you're off. And that's still going on now. I had an email from an organisation that said, we're going back now to doing 3 food parcels, and that's it. And I thought that was absolutely disgusting, you know. They get more donations and more financial help than others, but they're cutting back theirs. I don't understand it at all. Hunger hasn't gone away. We're talking about people who have, like what Ray and everyone says, they've got no access to the internet. They've got no credit on the mobile phone. They're not well enough to go out. We've got a lot of COVID people who have had COVID, like myself, who are long-term COVID sufferers, which means that people can't go out as they used to. They can't do what they used to. Even with long COVID, you struggle sometimes cooking a meal or even going downstairs in the morning, you know. It's really, really hard. But people are hidden behind the walls, you know. Long COVID, is it being spoken about? People aren't talking about food poverty, like you said, and it's absolutely rotten. It should be the number one issue on everyone's list, shouldn't it? And it's absolutely wrong. There's a feeling of shame as well. I've had quite a few conversations with people who are now in poverty, but they weren't. You know, they had jobs and everything. A lot of them were small businesses, and now the businesses are folded and they're reliant upon a system that can't support them. And they're saying, they're phoning me up and saying, oh, Charlotte, I'm only getting this amount of money now. Is that right? You know, and I said, yeah, that's right. Well, how are we supposed to manage on it? And my answer was, well, we've had to manage on it for such a long time now. We'll help you to try to get through this. But we did tell you what it was like. You know, people weren't listening. It's a case of people don't think it's going to happen to them until it does happen to them, and it's hard to accept. Also, I'm absolutely devastated that the 3 boxes were, you know, the boxes that the colourful councils are hanging out and everything, they're ending. Well, they've ended. But the food quality in some of them, it was absolutely disgusting. You know, it was all carbs and a few, I think you got 1 or 2 apples and 1 or 2 oranges or something like that. And that, for someone who is already in ill health or with COVID, is absolutely doing them no good at all. But the government weren't bothered about that. All they wanted is for this food to go out. We weren't bothered what was going in it either, which is absolutely disgusting, you know. We've got Like,
what do you think we should be doing then, Charlotte? In terms of, clearly there's a massive problem there, and you know, the quality of you know, the stuff that is being provided is inadequate. We're seeing, as I've already mentioned, the end of the furlough scheme at the end of October. We're seeing the benefit reforms and the cuts to social security. This is obviously creating a massive crisis, exacerbating an already huge crisis. What would your advice be in terms of what do we do? How do we challenge this? I mean, how can we you know, practically deal with these really terrible circumstances, which are already hitting many people and are going to hit an even bigger number of people in the last few months of this year and into next year?
One of the solutions, I think, is to put more pressure on the supermarkets to donate the food, not the people who are already poor, that already buy that food, to put it in the basket, then they're not having enough food to eat as well. It's absolutely disgusting that these big, massive corporations cannot and will not give free food out like that. You know, they won't put their own food in the baskets and hand them out. And it's also not fair that the independent food banks who work extremely hard are being left out of this, and they're the ones that do all the outreach work. And that's terrible. One thing is to support the local independent food banks. Let's give them a push, you know. Let's tell the council, stop funding your mates, you know, stop funding these bigger organisations. What about the other one that fed like 150 people in the last 3 days, you know? They don't get any funding for that. We need to talk to schools as well, because it's unacceptable that children aren't being given time to eat. And also, they can't pay for the meals if they can't pay online, you know, in a lot of schools. It's absolutely terrible. The schools aren't addressing it, but they're in a bit of a situation here because they don't know what to do, you know. The teachers are getting ill, the children are getting ill. There's a lot of very ill children now. You know, like there's already the year groups of lots of bubbles already gone out my daughter's school in the last week or so. It's just horrible. It's absolutely terrible. I've spoken to people in the past, and look what Ray says about people stealing to eat. It is a big problem, you know. And you say to someone, well, I understand why you're doing it, you know. I do the same thing too, you know. If you're hungry, you know. And it's because they can't see any other way out, because no one tells them, you know. If they've not got the internet, they don't know about it. They're not going out because they've got, you know, because of COVID and the high risk, or they just don't want to go out, or they can't go out because the buses cost a lot of money, don't they? You know, it's just terrible. We need to target them in some way, you know. We need to support the people that can do it. Groups like myself and like Ray's and that, you know, let's give them a bit of a, you know, let's provide them with the means to help people on their estate, you know, in their area, because that makes a big, massive difference, you know. I mean, the other week,
absolutely,
I fed like,
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you know, I remember years ago at school and so on, reading about in history, poor people being penalised, being criminalised for stealing food. I never thought. I mean, this was kind of Middle Ages, and I never thought that when we got to the 21st century, that we'd be seeing the very same thing happening again. I mean, it truly is a scandal, and we obviously do need to be bringing pressure to bear on our policymakers. And we just had a question earlier this evening from Rona Topaz, who's asking about the support from the opposition, Labour opposition in the House of Commons to the government for its Coronavirus Act. And Rona's been asking various MPs, how long is this support going to continue? What's your take on the bipartisan approach? Do you think it's appropriate, or do you think that more could or should be done by the opposition in the House of Commons to highlight some of the issues that you've been talking about this evening, Charlotte?
I mean, I know they're working hard, but they do really need to step up a bit more and provide some opposition to this. Food poverty, food hunger, fuel poverty needs to be highlighted every single week at PMQs, you know. It needs to be spoken about. They need to be talking about it all the time. And at the moment, we're not hearing anything at the moment that is of any value to us, you know. It's let's celebrate Christmas. Let's get let's get the community celebrating Christmas. Well, I'm sorry, but the people I speak to have already cancelled Christmas because they know they can't afford it. They won't be having Christmas dinner and they won't be giving presents, you know. That isn't our priority. Our priority is feeding people, isn't it? You know, it's keeping them in their homes and to feed them. And it's a no-win situation if no one is supporting us, and we've got to do it ourselves, and it's really hard work, as Ray will tell you. You know, it's never ending. We need to put pressure on them. Like you said, we need to email them, you know, email our MPs, even if they're a Tory MP, we email them, you know, and because they've got to wear it as well. They can bin it, but it's a, you know, that's up to them.
Email them, but also I think there's a case isn't there where MPs operate their own sort of face-to-face advice surgeries to go and see them.
Yeah.
And I know when I was an MP, clearly it was more impactful seeing a constituent face-to-face who'd got an issue, because you really got a handle on the real implication for the person in front of you, as it were. Much more so, I think, than dealing with an email. I think emails and your social media, etc., are important to try and put the pressure on. But if you know, get delegations together and go individually if you can't do that, and really, you know, put them behind the 8 ball. Actually, you know, trace them down. I think is in my opinion anyway. I think it will certainly, you know, be useful. But let me just go to Ray, if I may, because I'm just interested in your thoughts, Ray, about the bipartisan approach that we're seeing from the official opposition in the House, and what do you make of that? And when you finished giving a view on that, I've had a question from Nat Sims asking if there's any way of accessing funding online for some of the work that you have been doing and urging others to take on, to sort of, I suppose, seed corn funding perhaps, to, you know, help people get going. But what's your thoughts about the bipartisan approach that Keir Starmer seems so keen on at the moment?
I think it's quite scandalous. I think sort of the food hunger, to a certain extent, really links back to Brexit. You've got to remember that the poorest areas feel very left out and abandoned long ago, whether it's, you know, Labour areas or Tory areas. You know, for some time, I mean, we all had hope when Jeremy Corbyn came along that he was going to transform the country, had the policies. And although my own motion calling for a Minister for Poverty was passed at constituency Labour parties and at Blackpool Party conference, it isn't still Labour Party policy. And I think the problem is that all the political parties are so busy chasing the right that they're forgetting the left. And one of the interesting things I found out when I was knocking doors for Corbyn in 2017 was that the data we had was all old Labour. We'd stopped knocking on the doors of the people who had left because of Iraq. And therefore, on the night of the election, we all thought we'd lost badly. And then, of course, there was that letter from 172 MPs saying Labour should not have Jeremy Corbyn as his leader. The MPs said he would be unfit, not just to lead Labour, but the country. And when you've got core Labour Party activists and voters told that type of spin and negativity from their own MPs, you can understand how we lost that general election. I mean, the reality is the MPs failed us and we lost by 23,000 votes the general election of 2017. We wouldn't have Boris now. And so it's a failure of political classes who don't understand poverty. To be fair, Angela Rayner has experienced poverty. There's a handful of them who know about poverty. But the problem is that once you get into the system of Westminster, whether it's you're seduced by the ermine of the House of Lords, it still shocks me the numbers of hardcore socialists, including my own local former MP, Joan Ruddock, who was an equality minister, who's now a dame, how they're so easily bought. And I think the whole system of political class is actually broken. I think the party system we have at the moment is failing those most at need. That's why we have Black Lives Matter. That's why we have the climate change movement. That's why we have solidarity, not charity. The reason we have all these groups is because the political system is failing us. And I'm you know, trying to do that in my own way, are trying to find models which bypass the political elite, bypass the party system, and actually allows us to deliver help and support to the communities ourselves and circulate our own money within our own communities. And going back to the issue your caller had earlier on saying about access to money, groups like mine do not get money. the focus of the money is on specific groups, in the same way that 3 million self-employed people couldn't access money or grants when the lockdown hit. There was 3 million well-to-do coffee shop owners, journalists, theatre producers, all sorts of people you would normally think were well off, suddenly found they had to use the food bank because they could get no grants, no funding, no bank loans. So that was, that dealt with that. With my food bank, we have tried and tried. I've spent hours trying to get funding. If it wasn't for my GoFundMe page and the sale of my books, which I use the funding from my book, Food Bank Britain and others, that funds my work, then we wouldn't be able to do it. And Charlotte made a really important point about the quality of the food we give people. My food bank is the only one in the UK that actually targets food that is healthy. So we take into account not just the dietary requirements, but also the health impact. Because even if you are rich, if people are poor and they eat rubbish, they end up going to the NHS and they overwhelm the NHS. We all pay for that. If we want a more efficient NHS, we need to make sure that the people at every level of society have access to healthy food. And we need to be talking more about being vegetarian, about vegan. That is a real alternative, and there's real choices now. But the reality is that the money, and as Charlotte said earlier on, a lot of the money will go to local food banks, which are high corporate. Many of the food banks now pay their CEOs in 5-6 figures. The money goes to the people at the top, and most of them are run by volunteers who work for free, but the people that run these organizations are earning a fortune at the moment. It's become more corporate, which is freezing out food banks. Getting access to food and toiletries is harder. Many of these organizations that are household names don't give the food for free. They get it for free, but to cover their costs, they charge us a service charge. They charge us a monthly membership fee. How is that good? And then they control our money and our food supply. So it's, we need a bigger issue, and we need to encourage when people donate, please, please, please donate to your independent food banks. There's a brilliant organization, the Independent Food Aid Network, which is national, that will give you the list of every food bank that's independent in the UK. And that's a good way to start. But don't give money and don't give food to any of these corporations. And even the big stores, when you see those boxes in your supermarket, check who's collecting that food. And remember, these supermarkets are selling the food that ends up in those boxes. They're not giving you any food. They're profiteering from it. And nobody seems to think, oh, Tesco's or wherever, these are lovely people, they're giving food. They don't give food. They get their customers to buy the food from the stores, and then it goes into a bin, and then it's passed on. So a lot of these illusions of goodwill do not exist. And even the biggest food bank in the UK, we are told, is a certain one with 2 big initials at the beginning of it. The largest food bank operator in Britain is the Salvation Army. The second is the Independent Food Aid Networks. The third is the Trussell Trust. And yet whenever you hear the Labour politicians or the Tory politicians, the figures they quote are the 1.5 million food parcels that the Trussell Trust give out, because they have a great marketing and PR department which drives their fundraising. The reality is, when you add in all the food banks together, before COVID, it was 4.8 million people getting food aid, 4.8 million. In America, before COVID, it was 28 million American families were getting food stamps. That's greater than the entire population of Spain. And nobody is interested in food. Even there's 12 million officially in poverty in Britain, a huge voter section of the community that could be mobilized to vote if somebody spoke in their language. No political party of any description has a minister responsible for the eradication of poverty. And that is a real scandal, not just in the UK, but globally, because poverty and food hunger is a global issue. And October is Global Poverty Awareness Month. We shouldn't need a month. We should be aware of it every day we see people around us in our street corners, whether it's relatives that are going hungry or whether it's the news articles of the people starving to death in Britain in 2020.
Very, very appropriate, though, Ray, that it's October, because it's October when the furlough scheme is coming to an end. And you sort of anticipated a question, actually, that Mark Anderson had put to us. He said he often contributes to the local in the local supermarket that's collecting for the homeless, and he's asking the question: would it be better to hand the food directly to the person or to the local community centre? I think from what you've said, it's cut out the middleman, as he put it. I think from what you're saying, if you can go directly to the individual, or indeed to the independent food bank, from what you're saying, that would be a better option than simply giving the food at the supermarket. Would you agree with?
I mean, I agree totally. I mean, people don't realise that the food they give is sold.
Yes, indeed.
Everything, all these corporations. So they don't. You know, we need to be clear on this. They don't technically sell the food. What they do is they sell you a franchise fee, which is the only way you can access the food, or they charge you a monthly membership fee, service fee, which then is hit because it's a service with premium rate VAT. So food banks are the only food organisation in the UK which actually pays VAT on the food. It's completely outrageous.
Interesting point about some of the bigger organisations, and we did approach the Trussell Trust to see if they would contribute to this programme, and unfortunately they wouldn't talk to us. But let me just bring back in Candy. We've only got about three minutes left, and we just had a question from another viewer who's saying, what can we do in a practical sense to pressure local authorities and councils, regardless of party, to engage more with the food bank crisis? Candy, what's your thoughts on that as a serving local council? I'll try and come to all three, and this will probably have to be the last question. What in a practical sense, Candy, do you think can be done? Are you still with us, Candy? I think we've lost Candy.
No, I'm still here. I'm still here.
Yeah. Did you catch that question?
Yeah, I did. I think the issue is that councils themselves aren't getting the income, because more and more people are relying on benefits, and more people are applying for council relief for their housing and council tax, and so the councils themselves aren't getting the money. So it's up to communities to address the shortages. And of course, as Ray just says, you know, they're really struggling. These independent, we've got a few independent, and they're doing great. They're doing great, but they haven't got fixed accommodation. They haven't got a base. And they're struggling, like Ray's people, to get enough food and the right kind of food. And the longer that COVID goes on, the more people who are becoming unemployed and losing their incomes, the more we're going to have food poverty, the more we're going to have malnutrition, and the worse it's going to be for people's prospects. You know, this thing can carry on for 6 months. I don't know if a vaccination's on the horizon. We keep hearing it might be. But I can't see a lot changing for some time yet. So we've all got to work as a community. We're not going to get help from the government. We know this government don't give a monkeys about us. And as far as the opposition,
absolutely,
Let
me just take, because we've only got a couple of minutes, let me get Charlotte's take on that. I mean, that was a question, Charlotte, saying what in a practical sense do you think can be done to pressure local authorities and councillors, regardless of party, to engage more with the food bank crisis? What would you advise people who are watching this evening to do to bring pressure on local authorities?
We need to keep reminding them that there are independent food banks out there that are struggling. They're that busy supporting their own favourites, the ones that are in their good books, so to say, because they're tied into them via money, financial, and all sorts of different housing and all that sort of thing. We need to keep reminding them that we're in it, that there's an independent food bank there. They don't get any funding from anybody for this. They're giving out just as many food parcels, if not more. You need to be helping them as well, but let's cut the ties off it. You shouldn't have to sign a contract with a local authority to say, right, we'll give you this money, we'll help you. No, it doesn't work like that. Local authorities should just say, will help you. So the local food banks, the independent ones, and the people that use the independent food banks, and everyone else involved, we need to keep putting the pressure on them by saying, why haven't you been donated to this one? Why haven't you been encouraging people to go to this other food bank? Why haven't you told them about this food bank? Because they're there, they're not in their pocket, so to speak. And also making it aware that this does happen, you know, it's wrong and it does happen. And so many people are doing such amazing work out there, but the council doesn't tell people about it, you know, because they're not in their pockets. And that's an issue up and down the country, as Ray will tell you, you know. All we could do is raise as much awareness online, promote the independent ones as much as possible, which is what I've always done. I am food out, and I know what it's like. We've got something one day, we have. I mean, the other week I fed 4 families, you know, on my estate. That's all I could do, but I fed 4 families quite easily. I didn't get any help from the local authority for that. They won't go near me, you know, and that's a sad reality of it, you know. And I'm sure a lot of that. I mean, I'm lucky.
There's probably a case then, Charlotte, for as with MPs to pressure our local councillors, and in some ways should be a bit easier to pressure local councillors because they are much more in the community than the Parliament tend to be. And many local councillors do operate their own advice surgeries too. So again, people can go along and press and just raise awareness. I mean, I think it's bringing pressure, but also raising awareness, because sometimes councillors won't necessarily always be aware of the huge difficulties that people are experiencing. And so it's really important, I think, that we bring pressure to bear wherever we can. Look, we're out of time, I'm afraid. In fact, we've gone over time. Can I just thank Ray, Charlotte and Candy for another interesting discussion this evening. And hopefully there's been some really useful practical suggestions come through that people who are watching this can take forward in their own local community. And what we'll also try and do as we, as the resistant movement, are building up our movement, and we're setting up these regional hubs now, we'll pass on some of this really useful ideas that are coming out of these programs, with a view to encouraging people up and down the country to put in place some of the projects that we've heard about tonight, and to also bring about pressure and organize campaigns to push our elected representatives in the local authorities and indeed in government, in Parliament, to step up to the plate and be doing more. As I keep mentioning, you know, Britain is an incredibly wealthy country. It's the 5th biggest economy still in the world. There is absolutely no justification for anybody to be going hungry, for anybody to be homeless, for anybody to be living in poverty in Britain. And I think the challenge for all of us really is to demand of our representatives, because we are supposed to be living in a democracy, a representative democracy. Our representatives need to be doing more to actually represent the people that elect them, and that's really down to us, I think, to put pressure on them to ensure that they do their job properly. So thank you everyone for watching Resistance TV again this evening. Tune in next week at the same place, same time, 7 o'clock. Thank you very much for watching this evening, and good night.